Are we heading towards a food crisis? In the last few weeks, I made videos talking about energy, specifically oil and gas, and the dependence between Europe and Russia on these resources. Now it is time to talk about another type of energy: food. It is mid-2022. The war in Ukraine continues. The pandemic is subsiding, but it is not over yet, and there's a lot of economic uncertainty. On top of all this, now there is talk about a possible food emergency. Millions of people could be at risk of malnutrition and hunger, even starvation and death. How true and how bad is this food crisis? Well, join me in this video where we will find out. Is the world running out of food? Let's start by acknowledging that for decades, the world has done a phenomenal job providing food for a growing population. We are close to 8 billion people living in this planet, and thankfully the vast majority of us have enough to eat every day. This has been the result of better technology and efficiency. But just as important, we have robust supply chains to distribute food and move it around the world. And we have an open economic system that has allowed liquidity and trade. As a side note, I believe we should be grateful and acknowledge how fortunate we are. Compared with most of human history, today the world produces massively more food than before. We could talk about all the science, technology, and ingenuity that made this possible. I am especially fascinated by the Green Revolution. But this will be the story for another video. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there are cases of malnutrition and hunger, but these have not necessarily been the result of lack of food. Just think of how much food is wasted. It is rather the problem of distribution, getting the food to the right place at the right time. Whether it is bread, broccoli, or broiled stew, the world's food supply is a finely calibrated machine. Countries produce, import, and export, and a lot of food crosses borders before arriving at our plates. But to feed the world, we need the entire world. There are global organizations that keep track of food supply and work on anticipating potential problems and bottlenecks. The FAO, or Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, helps countries ensure good nutrition. The World Food Programme, or WFP, is a humanitarian agency that gives assistance in emergencies. So what's going on with food supply right now? Well, I will summarize 3 things that are currently happening. Let's go through them one by one. Number 1, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, we come back to Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Both Ukraine and Russia are large producers and exporters of food, especially grains and oils. Ukraine has been known as the breadbasket of Europe. The country is flat, the soil is fertile, it is well irrigated by large rivers, and the geographic position is in the middle, with Europe on one side, Russia and Central Asia on the other, and the Black Sea to the south, giving access to the Mediterranean and beyond. Let me share some numbers from the FAO, published by The Economist. Ukraine and Russia are responsible for a very large amount of trade: 28% of the world's wheat, 29% of barley, 15% of maize, and 75% of the world's sunflower oil. These are exports. All told, both countries supply around 12% of the world's calories. Ukraine's exports alone provide calories to feed around 400 million people. But the story gets more complex when we look at individual countries. In the case of wheat, countries like Turkey and Egypt rely on Russia and Ukraine for about 40% of their supply. Other countries have higher reliance on Russian and Ukrainian wheat. The Democratic Republic of Congo relies 46%, Libya is 65%, the UAE is 67%, and Uganda is almost 100%. This wheat makes its way to many other African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and as far away as Indonesia. The problem we have is that due to the war, the Ukrainian wheat that is ready for exports cannot get to the markets. The silos are full, with the grain harvested before the war, but the port city of Odessa is blocked. The Ukrainians have put mines in the water to avoid a Russian attack. But this now means that trade out of the port is virtually impossible. They are trying to move some of the grain by land to the west, through Romania, Poland, and the Baltics. But no more than 10 or 20% can be moved this way because the logistics are much harder. But that's not the only problem. Since the silos are full, Ukrainian farmers will not be able to store the grain from next harvest, which could lead to food rotting in the fields instead of landing on the plates of people in Africa or the Middle East. On top of that, the fact that the war is still ongoing and that some of the farms have been destroyed means that future crops may be delayed or even missed completely. If we cannot get grains out of Ukraine, can other countries make up for the difference? Well, this leads to the second point: global warming. The rise in temperatures globally is making the weather more erratic and unpredictable. This is affecting production of grains in other parts of the world too. China, the world's largest wheat producer, had extreme rains last year, which delayed planting, resulting in a smaller harvest this year. India, the world's second largest producer, suffered a heat wave that is reducing production yields. Other countries are also affected. Countries like the United States and France are paying close attention to the weather because lack of rain can affect production even further. The Horn of Africa is suffering its worst drought in 40 years. Even before the war in Ukraine, the World Food Programme had already predicted that 2022 would be a difficult year for food supply. Remember, they look at production, demand, inventories, and trade, and figure out how food needs to flow to supply a hungry world. But beyond the war and the weather, there is still another point we need to discuss: inflation. The recovery after COVID was never going to be smooth. We knew the economy would stutter. Why is this? Well, because demand and supply don't necessarily match with each other. As the pandemic subsided, demand for certain things grew faster than others. For example, during lockdown, you don't go on holiday, but you still buy food. On the other side, supply was not ready. Factories that stopped working were not ready to restart quickly. People who lost their jobs were not available to do the work. The supply chains went into crisis. Ships were moored in the wrong place. Containers were stranded in California but needed in Asia. I think of this like a car misfiring and jerking. It stops because it doesn't have fuel. Then it stops again because it needs tires. Then again because it needs antifreeze. The misalignment creates scarcity. And when something is scarce, but there is demand for it, it creates inflation. On top of that, some governments like the United States provided stimulus to incentivize consumption. Basically, they gave money to people. And then we have energy prices. Oil, gas, electricity, they have all gone up. The price of nitrogen fertilizers, of which Ukraine and Russia are also major exporters, are up by 6 times since last year, increasing costs for farmers everywhere. We are all feeling the inflation. I'm sure you have seen that food prices at the supermarket are higher than they were a few months ago. While this is inconvenient for some of us, it can be life-threatening for poor countries. You see, buying food represents about 10 or 15% of the budgets of households in rich countries. In emerging economies, this number goes up to about 25%. But in very poor countries, for example in sub-Saharan Africa, it can represent as much as 40%. And if those poor countries are precisely the ones that rely heavily on imports of food from Ukraine and Russia, if that food doesn't arrive, it can push hundreds of millions of people into an emergency. And while grain could potentially be imported from other locations, higher energy and fertilizer costs will push food prices higher, making the situation worse. So, to summarize, the war in Ukraine has disrupted supply and distribution of food. Extreme weather events are affecting possible replacements. And whatever food is available, it will have a higher price due to inflation. All this sounds ugly, but there are solutions. They can be achieved through cooperation and political will. Let's look at some of them. First, stop using food to make fuels. Some rich economies, such as the United States and some countries in Western Europe, have mandates to blend renewable ethanol into fuels. When you visit a fuel station in these countries, you may see a label at the pump that says up to 10% ethanol. These countries want to use renewable fuels that can be grown locally and rely less on fossil fuels. But this is only a minor top-up. 90% of the fuel is still normal gasoline that comes from oil refineries. And while renewable fuels have some merit, where do you think this ethanol comes from? It's made from corn. Today, approximately 10% of all grains around the world are used to make biofuels, and 18% of vegetable oils end up in biodiesel. If we have a food emergency, these biofuels could be easily substituted with non-renewable replacements. And it needs to happen quickly. Feeding people is more important than feeding SUVs. Second, a lot of grain is used to feed animals. According to the FAO, 13% of the food for animals is grain that could be redirected for human use. In 2021, China used more grain to feed its pigs than Ukraine exported in the entire year. Of course we need to feed animals, but it should be possible to modify the sources of calories for human and animal consumption, especially if the food emergency gets worse. Third, keep the markets open. The worst thing we can do now is to panic, hoard inventories, and blame others. We have a few months to put in place solutions to address this food crisis, but this requires coordination and decision. Some countries, for example Indonesia, are switching their calorie sources from wheat to rice. Other countries, especially very poor ones in Africa, could be supported by the World Bank and the IMF to be able to finance food imports. Finally, we need to get the grain out of Ukraine. Sounds like a good slogan. There are 25 million tons of corn and wheat currently trapped in the country, which would be enough to feed the world's least developed countries. International cooperation is needed to open the sea channels and protect the ships so that the grain can be exported out through the Black Sea and the Bosphorus into the Mediterranean. The international community needs to work together with Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and others, including China and India, to ensure this can happen. This sounds like a difficult compromise, but this type of cooperation has happened before. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, military convoys were used to escort oil tankers out of the Gulf so that energy markets could remain supplied. This is the situation, and these are the possible solutions. Make no mistake, this is not a biblical apocalypse. This is a man-made problem that can be relieved with man-made solutions. Even for Mr. Putin, this goes beyond one man with imperial aspirations. In addition to the millions of people in Ukraine that have been killed, displaced, or ruined by this war, there are hundreds of millions more who could suffer malnutrition or even famine and death. There is precious little time, but with awareness, management, and will, this potential food crisis can be anticipated and resolved. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Click on the links to see some of my other videos, some of which talk about the war in Ukraine and its effect on the markets for oil and gas. And feel free to leave your comments, click like, subscribe, whatever you want. And I'll see you next time.